Okay, so I'm gonna give my spiel of just my experience wading through these readings because they're a big, they're sort of like big pillars that are holding up my personal work, and then in informing the environmental data justice theoretical framework as a whole. And what really, starting with design justice, that's the first time where I started to really think about design, and in this case, like building environmental data infrastructure in terms of intersectionality. When I went to the Data Justice Conference in Cardiff, Sasha Costanza-Chock gave the keynote address, and that's the first time that I learned about their work. And they talked about going through airport security as trans, and the fact that the airport security sign, or, you know, when you go through those big giant detector or scanners, they click on whether you're male or female. So then people who are trans always get pulled to the side. And then as I'm thinking about that in terms of intersectionality, I'm thinking, what if you're trans and a person of color as well? You know, you're probably always going to get pulled for extra security measures or something. And I noticed that myself, like in the summer when I'm darker, I get pulled, and also when I wear my hair up in a bun, because the whole system is based on white and cisgender people, that hairdos that go outside of that, they just throw off the system, and it's like red. So then in response to these sort of issues, the whole idea of design justice is bottom up design. And like I said before, I think the term design, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit more, of what does design mean? Like, is it engineering as well as planning? And then how does that inform, or how does that work within environmental data justice? And I would say, building new tools that are from the lens of community members. So then that takes me to the fair and care principles. And I think those are like a more concrete, or really good concrete guideline for data scientists and technologists who are working, and scientists who are working with communities and vulnerable populations as well. And these principles are really popular and come out of the US Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network. And recently I wrote one of my comprehensive exam papers on how scientists can apply the CARE principles to genomic research. So there in research, there's just a long history of extractive research that's either killed people or perpetuated ideas of racism and sexism or heteropatriarchy, and also getting caught up in this cycle of research being co-opted by capitalism and being for profit instead of for the interest of people. And then pollution is colonialism. I think that really reoriented myself towards the connection between environmental hazards and land, land, and then how that's all tied into and produced by a whole history of the state being built on native land, and through the appropriation of this land in order to generate capital. So then throughout all these readings, I listed key themes somewhere. Okay. Well, the extractive logic, I think, is done on theme. It's like systems of power are taking, taking whatever kind of capital plan, people's information, people's health and livelihood, taking that in order to produce, produce academic papers, produce, whatever feeds their power. And I'm part of this too, and produce money. So that's my deal. And Rico, I don't know if you want to go about and just reflect on the other articles.
Yeah, so I can just sort of just generally start with my own reason for being interested in this line of study. I think as someone who has like a political background, I've spent plenty of time talking to, well, I shouldn't say family background. I think we've all had this experience of just talking to people who believe that, and I'm kind of particularly interested in the racial aspect of this, but who believe that racism exists and will always acknowledge that, but who localize it to just being a interpersonal phenomenon, and that systems aren't persons, and so systems don't encode those biases. And that's really hard to sort of walk, especially in a little conversation where you're trying to change someone's mind. It's really hard to walk through how a whole system gets shaped and born and fortified with all these small decisions. And I think I'm particularly interested in applications of algorithms for very simple to understand life purposes that carry with it the biases of the data that are used to generate it, or the creators of the algorithms themselves. And one reason I'm interested in it is I think because it's so hard to say, hey, listen, Uncle Jim, listen, man, the system's racist. And he's like, look, I don't doubt that there are politicians and there are DMV workers who are racist, but like the system is not the problem. And I think this is like a really clean, and by clean I mean like easy to understand story about, look, Black Americans are 12% of the American population, 12 to 15%. That means that if you're trying to source Black faces and arms and bodies to teach a car to stop when it sees that, you're only feeding it roughly 12% of the images. If you're doing a good job, 12% of the images you're getting to the algorithm to train on are Black arms and legs and blah, blah, blah. So that means it's going to be significantly less talented at spotting those things, and therefore it's going to stop just a little bit slower, blah, blah, blah. And all these things feed into a real danger that is not the fault of and I'm going to put this all in quotes, not in fault of the researchers who went and just got as much data as they possibly could, or not in the fault of the researchers who wanted to make sure that the data that they got is representative of the population that is going to be impacted by these cars, right? If they say, this is an algorithm for cars that are driving in America, well, 15% of Americans are Black, so we're going to have 15% of the images that we train our algorithm on to be Black. And that presents a real problem. And you can sort of look at this as a summation of a lot of well-meaning decisions at different points in the chain that results in a really horrible outcome where our Black neighbors are walking down the street and not sure if an autonomous vehicle is going to be a stop for them when they're crossing the street. And that is systemic. It's not specifically tied to one person saying a bad joke, which we all so easily define as racism. It's part of a system of norms that develop that have shaped whiteness in America as default, not necessarily better or worse, but default. When you think of just an average American, most people think of a white family. And what, I shouldn't say most people, most white people do, I'm sure. So the impact of that is that that gets encoded in our daily lives. And unless we're consciously working to reverse that, we're going to do that. We're on this verge of amping up everything about our society considerably. And every little elements of racism that exist in these algorithms, they will be in the car that I drive, in the Uber that I pick up, in the blank, in the blank, in the blank. And whatever racism is tied into the system is about to get multiplied. And so that's a real interest of mine in terms of trying to educate myself and others on how this happens so that we can sort of convince more people that this is a real clear systemic case, because this seems to be like the cleanest version of that. Like, I think there's a lot of people who aren't going to believe that the system is racist unless they see everybody with the federal government job say something really terrible about another race. And that's just not how it actually exists. So that's how I've been drawn to the subject. That's my own little philosophy. So I tried to share some readings of just very lightweight, here's a tech application and here's why it's doing a shitty job of kind of perpetuating an encoded norm, and that norm being racially or otherwise tinged, for lack of a better word. I'm trying to find articles that I found. Oh man, where did these go?
I think they're on the GitHub.
Oh yeah, okay.
We still need to put them on the HackMD.
I put it in the chat. They were in the email too.
Well, so what you were saying about, I think that definitely connects with design justice. I know Sasha has writes about that algorithmic bias. But I'm just thinking, like, all of our materials are built from these systems of oppression. You know, like this Nalgene bottle and the straw, and like everything is built from this system. Because, for instance, coming from an environmental perspective, just making plastics, people of color are disproportionately affected by the emissions from making those plastics. And we buy into that whole system. And the wealth that's generated from that, I mean, there's a really good article by Wendy Leo Moore of what whiteness is, because, the ideas of white and black come out of racism, come out of that system. And the idea that whiteness is property, is like that wealth that generations have inherited from slavery, and also that ability to navigate life without that kind of discrimination.
I liked where you were going with that, Lourdes. Specifically, I guess one of the things that I think is really important about understanding various forms of bias, including racism, is sort of this, I don't know if I should call it a privilege or a right, to not worry about it, because things are just made with you in mind.
I really like the design justice piece because it talks about like, it asks the question like who's being introduced at the beginning, who's being involved in the problem solving. Like I've been going down this design thinking pattern a little bit, and Lourdes, he asked earlier, what is design? And for me, it's just like problem solving, whatever realm that happens to be. So it could be, applications, it could be engineering, it could be design can happen in like all forms. And so that piece when they, which was, but just thinking about like, those questions at the beginning, like how are people involved and who gets to be involved, the communities that get to be involved, or like the communities affected being involved, which is why I also like that you shared the care principles alongside the FAIR principles, which is really great because the FAIR principles were just like really data centric, but the care principles were like talking about like the communities or like what would happen with like data and stuff. So thank you for sharing that. That was really cool. But yeah, just like thinking about design justice, it makes a lot of sense in this realm here. Like how do we make sure that these communities are brought forward at the very beginning of any problem solving exercise, any problem solving process?
I went to a Sunrise Movement training last summer that was held in Berkeley, and I don't know how familiar each of you is with the Bay Area, but when you drive north from Berkeley, there's a big, obvious petrochemical plant. It's a refinery. I don't remember which one it is.
Oh, Richmond?
Maybe. I've seen it from the highway. I don't really know.
Yeah.
But there was a woman who came to speak at the Sunrise Movement training, and Sunrise Movement has a lot of good things about it, but one of the and it like is a very explicitly inclusive movement, but I think a lot of more seasoned activists from different backgrounds see all the energy and all the hope, and they worry that it's naivety. So one of the things that the trainers, also youth, did was they made a point of bringing in some outside organizers to kind of coalition build, but also have them, like, give them space to speak. And one of the most interesting ones was a woman who lived kind of down the street from that refinery. And she talked about like what a visible symbol it is that that's happening in their community, which is a mostly Black community, I believe. And there's just a lot of reasons why like this plant emitting chemicals is just this blight. It's this obvious blight, and it's this thing people want to fight. And there's a thing that happens on a regular basis, which is protest groups get really upset about it and decide to go make a stand, and they march down the street. And she says, I live there and I'm an organizer, and not even once in like the 20 years, whatever it is, I don't remember how many decades, not even once have they come by and said, hey, we're thinking about doing a strike in your area. Do you want to join? And so it's this whole like, I mean, it's kind of related to the discussion that I've heard around like how easy it is to solve problems over in Africa versus here. You can solve their system because you can't solve yours at home. And it's not that it's easy, it's that you don't understand the complexity.
So my friend from my program actually wrote her dissertation on the Chevron refinery. And it's one of the largest refineries in the nation. And she wrote about the community activist groups and how the refinery also greenwashes everything. Like, they're like, oh, we're here, but Chevron will donate this whole garden and all these sustainable things to your neighborhood so that we can be green. And that goes along with the color blindness, or not color blindness, but what I talk about in the extractive logic paper, whitewashing. You know, it's just like, it's covering everything up, and all of those, the fact that they are profiting off of people's health. But something else I wanted to bring up was this idea of bias. And that, like, people, I feel like data justice people or technology people always say, oh, this algorithm is biased, etc. But then coming from a sociology of science perspective, you know, we sort of equate objectivity with, you know, with what we're talking about, color blindness. And the word bias implies that there is some sort of objectivity, but we know that objectivity doesn't really exist.
Yeah. Just how we're like, as a society, we're beginning to laugh at people who, or maybe this has been around a long time, but like who laugh at people that say they don't see color. I think we have to be, the ones who are closest to not seeing color are the ones who make sure that they see it. This is my way of sort of saying, like, so I worked at a fashion tech startup before Query, and we were training computer vision models on how to extract attribute data from fashion product images. So this is a gray sweater, it's a medium gray sweater, it's a medium gray men's sweater. And so from just the picture of a model wearing this, we were trying to teach computer algorithms how to do that. Now you'd think that when you get started on a project like that, you need 10,000 images that are classified on a taxonomy, and you feed that data into a neural network so that when I show the computer, so it can then learn. I sort of, when I began working there and seeing what we were doing, I was like, you know, almost all of the models that we're using are white, because that's the probably the most cost-effective way to make sure we get lots of pictures of lots of models, because most of the models are white. And I was curious about how this might do when we're trying to identify a blue bag with someone who's not white. And so we didn't get that far in the company. The company only lasted 11 months. But in order for the algorithm to be colorblind, it needed to see, this is a blue bag and it's being carried by a black person. This is a blue bag and it's being carried by a brown person. This is a blue bag and it's being carried by a white person. Like, the computers are very dumb until you make them very smart. It can be really expensive to source a lot of that training data. Like, you can imagine, like, hey, we're about to compete for a project where we tag colors of bags for a giant client. You know, you want to be able to do that quickly and cost efficiently. Well, then you're going to be searching for images of white models carrying blue and brown and yellow bags. And we, you know, I think like many tech startups, we didn't think the world, like, what am I trying to say? We weren't doing life or death work, but that's kind of not the point. Because the foundation of the work that we're doing and the approach that we're taking, if copied by everybody, encodes the wrong kind of color blindness, where I can't tell you what color this bag is because a black model's holding it. Well, that's a big problem. And not because it costs more to figure out what the color of that bag is, because then maybe someone has to go in and manually select, oh, the computer's never seen a black person before, this is a blue bag. You have to, so the point of like reducing someone, or to get to color blindness, you have to put all of these colors at the front of this person's memory. And I kind of like, I equated machine learning in the application we were using it to, imagine a young child fell off another planet, didn't speak any language that you spoke, and all you did was show them a picture and said blue, and then another picture and said green. Eventually, after thousands and thousands of images, they'll figure out what green means and what blue means, and that's essentially what you're doing with computer vision. But without giving more of the context of, like I said, green purse, white woman, tall, whatever, it's going to be blind to all of those other aspects. Just a fun, just a little confessional from my life.
You know, I think it's really interesting because I mean, I come from a startup background too. And one of the things that you really, really feel when you're in a startup is how urgent it is that you spend little and make lots. And I've like, I wish Brendan was here because I feel like we've talked about this a little bit, but I mean, frankly, it's why I left Silicon Valley. We talked, like, one of the things that Brendan and I have talked about is how different it is when he works at Query versus when he works at Edgy. Because within Edgy, one of the things that we do is work very slowly. And we take the problems and we take a lot of time and distance and thought. And it means that we don't get things done on like a product style speed. And like, for those of us who actually really enjoy making product, like, it's maddening, you know, like, you want to be able to produce, otherwise you feel like you're not doing anything useful, which is a whole other thing. But there's a huge value in doing things slowly, trying things that you don't complete because you've decided that it wasn't the right thing. I mean, I don't want to be a person who always goes back to, oh, well, capitalism. But there is something.
I am that person.
That's you, Lourdes. Yeah. But there is something very, very real to that, right? Which is like, this is us deciding what matters for ourselves, and therefore for the parts of society we have influence over.
Yeah.
In my context, it was, can we really afford to try to hire for diversity? Which was like, yeah. I mean, can we afford not to?
Those are the nuances of getting caught up in capitalism. I mean, we all, like, sometimes, what was that look, Kevin? Oh, you're...
No, I was just thinking, like, even Edgy has that problem with the diversity hiring, you know, and it's because, like, hiring is, it's not that you want it to be fast, but you don't want it to be too slow either, because then it just drains all their energy out, and then we just use that as kind of the excuse shortcuts. Like, we just don't have time for it, so we'll just hire, like, the easiest thing. And the easiest thing is just to stay within our networks and the people that we know already. And that's, like, yeah, like, Rico's agree. Like, yes, because it's really easy to get a lot of, like, white people pictures. Yes. Completely. Yeah.
And this whole fast pace thing, that we are, like, this is our life in this society. Like, we are always going, and that's what neoliberalism is about, is this idea of being extra efficient, maximizing your profits, getting, like, always needing more money. Sometimes you have to take a step back and think, and I think coronavirus is helping us do that. Of saying, wow, this is, there are things that are deeply flawed in the systems that we've created for ourselves, but we also need them. Or how do we live outside of them now?
I'm very disturbed this week by, like, I get how difficult it must be. Like, I don't personally get it, but I get that it is difficult for people to work from home while their children are not in school and not in childcare of any kind. On the other hand, I've been talking to a lot of parents who are, like, basically weighing, like, I don't know how to entertain them other than putting them in front of a screen. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, what? Did we forget that you can, like, play music and talk to people and go outside, and there's so many ways of being in the world that don't involve screens, and genuinely I think people have forgotten that. And it's like really biting people right now, and it feels hard to watch, because I mean, like, I'm good, look out there, I can go out there, but in the city maybe you're just in an apartment complex and you actually can't go anywhere, so you kind of have to have this virtual world that you actually live in. Which is why our algorithms and bias trainings are so important, because like if everything we do is moderated through a screen, and especially through the internet, like who controls the internet and how?
Yeah, and
right?
and the thing I'm most afraid of is that it's either not a person, or not a good person, or not enough people. And by controlling the internet, I'm just gonna like boil that big idea down into something small, which is just like my LinkedIn network, people who you should say hi to, or something. Or like let's just say 5 of my friends got a new job, and LinkedIn recommends that I congratulate them. How they go about not putting, or 25 of my friends get a new job, how do they put the 5 that I should congratulate in front of me is a decision by kind of no person, because there's an algorithm behind that based on the last 5 people I've messaged, or the last 5 people I haven't messaged. And that just in whatever behaviors, even if it's like, well, this is behavior specific to you. What am I trying to say? It's encoding the ways of working that exist today and like locking them in unless you proactively change them. Like whenever I think of like a Spotify song that I don't like, I'm worried about disliking it, because then I think I'm never going to hear that artist again, you know? Like the computer's going to learn too much from my, hey, there's my guy. I promise that I never will. And so, you know, I don't know the algorithm that recommends from LinkedIn who I should say hello to, but if I pass on 2 women in a row, if it then stops recommending that I say hello to women, or like congratulations on the new job to women, that I'm not going to remember that someone now works in an organization that could be great for my business. And so blah, 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 whatever. Like, it needs to not encode just your previous behaviors, because a lot of our previous behaviors are based on the networks that we grew up with. And we've all been locked in these segregated world. A lot of us have been locked in a lot of these segregated worlds, and those worlds are not going to change unless like those algorithms are cracked into from some other point.
I was thinking the same thing with Spotify of because I was thinking like I just like too many bands that are all white dudes, and I really need to stop that. But you know, I like the music that I like. And so, and then when I pass on stuff, or no, it's not when I pass on stuff, but when I like things, then Spotify's like, oh, she really likes white boy punk bands from the 90s. And so we're gonna like recommend some white boy punk bands from now. And I don't, like, I've made a rule for myself that if it's all cis white dudes from the past 5 years, like I'm not listening to that.
The best part is that your like music taste is supposed to be based on music that you've heard before and music that you've liked before, so it might actually work. You might stop liking them, or you might begin to like other sounds.
I mean, I have a really eclectic music taste, but you know, it's like your daily mixes. You know, one will be jazz, one will be hardcore punk, one will be like, you know, like the different variations, and then another will be like, I don't know. like shoegaze or something. But
Yeah. But what I think is really interesting about this, like, why is it that, I mean, I would expect that Spotify, LinkedIn, Facebook, all of them probably do specifically call out people and bands and stuff as white, male, female, Latino, whatever. Like, we do actually choose, like when we do machine learning, we do actually in most forms of machine learning, we do actually choose what parameters are being looked at. And we pick these ones because they're easy to identify, but they are in many ways the least interesting.
But then we're talking about the fact that they're not chosen, you know, that there is no equity in how these algorithms are built. Like, there's no algorithm, I'm assuming, on Spotify that says, oh, this person's listening to too much white music. We're going to put some black or people of color bands.
And this is, I think, a perfect distillation of your point, Lourdes, about, I actually would bet that I mean, I don't know. I bet most data sets at Spotify are not coded by the race of the author. And instead, it's like just the genre, because 90s punk bands were mostly white. Those things get correlated tightly. And so when you keep listening to that, you keep getting whiter audiences. And to your point about, like, in that sense, the algorithm was colorblind, but because it was colorblind, it therefore tied to another correlative thing, and therefore became pushing white music. If there was somebody, I shouldn't say white music, white punk 90s music, and if there were somebody on the engineering team who was like, I'm gonna tag these artists by the predominant race of most of the artists, or whatever, something like that, great. Or, you know, I'm worried that this black punk band in the East Bay is getting no or whatever. There's a black punk band in the East Bay, and so I'm going to weight things like, hey, I'm going to start putting bands in front of you that are like a little bit more local to your place. You know what I mean? Like, there are other categories that are not race specific that can get other kinds of music in front of you. Does that make any sense? Like, if I'm in New York and I listen to the same, I listen to NoFX, Pennywise, those are my bands. But if Spotify sort of was aware that 90s punk rock music was a white dominated genre, if it pushed up, because I'm a New Yorker, it pushed up a black punk band from like Queens into my feed, and I was like, this sounds cool. And then like, oh my God, they're from Queens. I'm much more likely to check them out because they're from Queens than because they're black. Anyway.
It also just, I know in their algorithms, they incorporate like the sound wave and match up not only according to genre, but according to just like the melodies and tones. So that will match to, you know, your interests. So I'm thinking, yeah, like so that's one way to get people to listen to more people of color music. But then I feel like, at least before all this material and readings came out and people started writing about this, the act of tagging a band with their race, like how white or how not white they are, would be perceived as racist. And then also is the question of, who are you to, you know, some white dude coder to determine the race of a band? So then you would have forms when the band puts up their information on Spotify that says, what's your demographic? And then the band will be like, why is this a question here? But I think that should be that should be a thing.
I think that's really interesting. I would love to see recommendation engines, and like you definitely see a lot of blog posts and especially librarian curations of, you know, how to read for a specific story that might not be part of the like existing mainstream, right? So like when I was in the Portland Library recently, I picked up a couple flyers that were movies and books centering Indigenous voices, or the whole what's it called? The In Your Own Voice, own voices, hashtag own voices, where you're specifically reading books that are written by the people that they're about.
Yeah.
I think that it's actually kind of interesting in our modern society. Like not everybody is interested in reading for diversity, but there's a huge population that is. I think that there's kind of a market available for recommendation engines that specifically give you stuff that's outside of the norm, stuff that's outside of the mainstream, like what everybody's reading or what everybody is used to reading.
Yeah. I just searched on Spotify punks of color and there's one playlist.
I mean, that's a great band name.
Mm-hmm. But and I think it does start with like putting together playlists, putting together book lists, curating things, and then fostering those sort of tastes. And not, I don't know. Freaking colorblind people.
I mean, I think this stuff is really interesting in terms of, like, in theory, given that it's data together, we're talking about algorithmic bias as an encoded algorithm. But we also have influence over how people think and perceive what normal is, right? Just by creating models of it. One of the things that I was doing for a while, just kind of as a pet hobby, was going through those book lists for, you know, whatever diversity category it is that was some book list of things that were released in the last year. And my local library has a recommend this book option. And so I could just put these in the library. I wouldn't even necessarily have to read them. They'd just be on the shelves. Like, it felt really powerful because they were just books that people didn't even know they existed.
Not John.
Switching gears a little bit, I think I also shared an article of TikTok moderators being alerted when someone who when a TikToker who has Down syndrome has like at least 6,000 people watching their video, a moderator is cued to check in and make sure that people aren't like making fun of that person. And so I'm also fascinated by like the unintended consequences of really good policies and practices. And you can make all the reasons why in the world today that's sort of a necessary process. At the same time, like imagine being someone with Down syndrome and knowing that if I get a certain level of popularity, I'm going to have moderators in my feed immediately. That's hurtful. I mean, maybe, I don't know. It depends. Everybody can interpret that differently, but I would be like, I'd feel othered by that. And we're fumbling through a lot of this best intentions, tech as it is, the world as it is, and the output is really messy.
That it's sort of like patronizing in a way. That someone has to look over you.
Right.
But I mean, I love it when people intervene and are like telling people off. like there's an organization, I don't know if they still exist, of white folks who come in and intervene in threads of racist people being racist, and to take the load off of the person of color in that thread who's like, y'all are being racist. They'll step in and will educate. And I mean, I think that's cool, and that's a good way for white people to engage in solidarity. But it's only when they're requested.
Okay, that's helpful.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to like the design justice thing. It's like, you ask people if they want to contribute, and this goes with edgy too. It's like you don't want to put the burden of contributing on people. You want to like give them the space and facilitate their contributions. And if they want to take a leadership role or like take charge, then have that space open, but not press.
It could actually be a really cool feature, actually, if TikTok, when you signed up, said, hey, are you a member of XYZ vulnerable population? Because if so, we can prioritize moderation requests that you submit. Like, that would be neat.
Yeah, I feel I should have really read through the whole case, but I think it's just triggered, right?
It read to me less positive than you presented it.
Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah, that's kind of how I don't want to say. Nah, skip me.
I guess I'm really curious about how folks think we can get around algorithmic bias, given that machine learning is definitely happening.
This Vox article talks. Kevin, go ahead. Sorry.
I was gonna say, I was just like, just give me a chronological timeline again, and no ads. Don't push anything. Just let me find it through serendipity. Like, I don't know. Because when I do like weird hacks when I do use social media like Facebook and stuff. Like for Facebook, you can create like personal lists, and I only use it through the browser, not through the app, like even on my phone. And then in that way, I'm able to see things chronologically without ads, and it's just like a very different experience because I like start to see stuff from people that I normally don't interact with, which is nice. So I would say, like, how do we turn off that? Is there a feature where we can just turn off the algorithm? Like, do we always need an algorithm to push at something? Like, I think the option of like turning it off completely when you don't want it would be a nice feature.
Yeah, I mean, transparency sounds like the very first step. Like, if you know exactly, I mean, this is the tension because this is the bread and butter. This is the trade secret. But if you knew exactly how it worked, you could adjust your behavior accordingly, or whatever, or maybe ask for changes. I mean, I basically know that my Instagram feed is some combination of things I like and things that look like the things that I have liked. Right? Like,
Instagram's the worst, or like,
sometimes
or the best in that way. What's that?
Sometimes I get those ads and I'm like, yes.
Yeah, Instagram is kind of widely recognized at doing ads pretty well, compared to other platforms, it seems like.
And the other thing is, yeah, big advertising, marketing, But the fact that you can put ads on Facebook for not a lot of money, it's like it really helps. If Edgy wanted to put up an ad, it would only cost a couple bucks. So it's like that's really cool about the technology. But then people can also spread misinformation using that, and can also target like African American population with misinformation and do damage that way.
Yeah, it's like really dangerous, like weaponizing being able to like specifically target people for things. This kind of leads me into like kind of like closer to like the D-Web stuff with like federated social networks, and like how much does it make sense for us to be like does it make sense for me to be connected to somebody I don't know in Egypt like right now, or should I be like having social networks with my neighbors? Like would it like there's I forget what it's called, like Scuttlebutt, where you can like see folks that are on the same network or just around you, and like is there a place for like smaller social networks instead of just like the ginormous Facebook where we're all on the same thing? That's like the question I wonder about. Like, what would that be like?
Yeah, that's a sword that cuts both ways, because the white Kevin Wens of the world who have the same genuine interest in keeping their world a little smaller, if they grew up in white worlds, are then keeping their all white worlds a little tighter, more tightly wound. Like if I don't know, unless you're proactively breaking against that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and it's like there's like this other question. It's like, well, how much of the social networks is our real life? Like, why are we spending so much time on it? And then like, because we're spending so much time on it, it just makes it easier to self-isolate in these like bubbles. Like if we had to like step out and like deal with like the people around us more often, how much would that change things? I don't know. Depends on where you're living, I guess too.
So depressing.
Yeah, I think I've just chosen to like, I mean, I'm already 35 and race has been a problem in my country for 500 years and a problem in the world for far longer than that. I think I've accepted the fact that it'll be a big part of the life of many of the people of the country that I live in for the rest of my time here. And so keeping the goal of erasing all of that for like another lifetime, just reducing the like worst parts of it. Like the fact, I'm just bringing this back, like the fact that an autonomous car can't as easily identify a black neighbor of mine is like a majorly scary problem. And that seems really, both like really scary and really fixable. And so I personally want to focus efforts on where those two things intersect, where like, look, let's get the big dangerous things reduced however we can. There may only be 3 black punk bands in the United States, and for there to be 6 might be progress, but like, that's a longer project.
They get Bad Brains, which is homophobic, and people are like, "Oh, Bad Brains! Oh, they're a black band." It's like, yeah, but they're big in it. So, always some nuances there.
Yeah.
I was reading an argument that machine learning, I'm trying to remember where this was from. I think it was an article, but I don't remember. It was making the argument that this is the only moment we can influence whether algorithms have bias, have our same biases. Because pretty soon machine learning will work faster than human ability to feed machine learning.
Totally.
Jeez.
Although I don't know if
Well,
that's
that
a
was a
helpful argument because it's just another one of those things that's huge and out of our control.
well, there was that question posed by one of the articles where it said like, in this vein of like slowing down, like should we even do this at all? Like some of like the facial recognition stuff, like article, like what is it actually useful for? Just unlocking our phones and tracking everybody wherever they're moving.
I mean, those Instagram like quick changing
Yeah.
card
I guess,
things.
yeah.
Some fun with facial recognition. But yeah, no, I agree with you.
Yeah, it's like,
What are the
Can we
nuclear
slow
bomb
down?
arguments where it brought us like all these other technologies that are household that we like?
say that
Yeah.
again, Kelsey? Sorry.
I feel like I've heard an argument about like it's a good thing we developed the H-bomb because it brought us all these other technologies that we really like.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, technology isn't bad, it isn't good.
Yeah.
It's another tool.
I mean, the only thing I'm sure about is that it's going to happen. I don't really believe in human abilities to suppress ideas
Mm-hmm.
like in any kind of permanent way.
Mm. Any other thoughts?
I had some stuff that was, as I was reading, it made me think about the ECHO project. And the thing that was, I had questions that maybe this can go into like whatever study people are doing. Sorry, I haven't been involved as much. But just like the fact, I heard Kelsey say this, so like basically these permits are like permissions to pollute, right? Like that's what all these permits are, is just like giving these whatever companies or whatever they happen to be permission to pollute. And I'm curious, like, this related to the design justice, like how are these thresholds determined? You know, when, like how long ago were these determinations made? Like were they thought about in aggregate? Like, okay, if it's okay for one whatever power plant to pollute that much, but what if we had 10 of them next to each other? Like, is there any like thought to the cumulative effect of like all of them being allowed to pollute in that like
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
do you know that stuff, Lourdes? I know you've been studying.
Yeah.
Or is that like the same questions that you have?
Yeah, and that's also like, yeah, that's what I've studied is just those thresholds being based on being generally based on white male bodies, and the idea that the dose makes the poison. That's totally, not really reflective of reality. And the fact that companies prevent certain science from happening. It's what this STS scholar, Scott Frickel, calls undone science. There's just loads of science about these chemicals that that isn't done.
Yeah. And so that's, I really like the design justice article because it just calls into those questions again. It's like, these people that are being affected, like why aren't they involved in the determination of these like permits and how they work and stuff like that, or how they were set?
I think there's a new algorithms officer for New York City. And I don't know exactly what their job and powers are, but I think one of the big missions of the people who cared about that position being created and shaped is just all of the data that any algorithm that goes into a city process, the algorithm is made public and the underlying training data, if it's machine oriented, is made public, so that at least people can take a look at it. And so this is sort of what I mean about like Kevin, your point of like, can I tune the algorithm for myself? It's like, well, the first step would be like at least understanding how it basically works as an instrument, right? And then
Yep.
Going from there. I'm trying to think of like some interesting city. There was a police effort in Chicago. I think it's still alive. It's sort of like predictive policing. If you've seen Minority Report, it's kind of like that, where they'd crunch all this data and they'd say like, look, you are likely to commit a crime or be the victim of a crime based on these factors. We're knocking on your door just to check to make sure that you've got housing, a job, blah, 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 because these are the 4 things that if you get those, you're much less likely to be on our list in the future. So like, how's your job, blah, blah, blah. And this is like wildly controversial for all reasons that are probably obvious to us. But a lot of people in communities that had their doors knocked on are like, some of them are like, why the fuck are cops knocking on my door proactively like this? And other people are like, oh my God, I'm so glad that they're checking on to make sure that like my housing is safe. And they helped me make a complaint about my landlord, blah, blah, blah. And so very brave new world.
Yeah.
And you can see all the obvious
like,
reasons it'd be
helpful or
concerning.
not.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the best version of predictive policing I could imagine.
Yeah.
I agree with you, Rico, that like the transparency of it like helps us determine like I had a similar thing where my friend she works at a school and they wanted to use some type of data analysis to find students at risk of failing and like reaching out to them first. But then there's all this identifying information about like their parents' income or whatever, and like so it's like this yeah, it's just like brave new world, like you were saying, for sure.
I don't know how I feel about it. Sorry.
I was trying to remember. I have a note here from when I read the Design Justice paper. I'm trying to decipher it, and maybe this will bring something up for you. But it's just design principles. The design process itself matches product best practices to ensure there's a market, but it becomes potentially extractive at the point of profit, balance versus incentive, and challenge design, and the challenge design and create a useful thing. There was
Wait, what was that about challenge design?
the challenge to design and create a useful thing. Because there is something really interesting. When I was reading that article about design justice, my education in design it's from a school of thought called user-oriented collaborative design. And it embodies the same principles that were outlined in the paper to a large degree, which is that you choose who your product is going to serve, and then you go and you meet some of them, and you find out what your product ought to be by way of interviewing them and then successfully showing them rough prototypes until you have something that really solves their need. And it's really cool because you're identifying problems. Like, you can't not identify a good problem that way.
Right.
Yeah.
On the other hand,
Yeah.
you've now used the input of these people to create a product that you wish to now sell to them and everyone like them for a profit. And it's not like, I'm not anti-capitalist enough to say that like there is some level of, well, you deserve to make some money for going through this process of design. Like, design and creation of a product is real work. It's useful work.
Yeah.
But exactly how much and where is really much more a function of like, how much can you get for it?
Yeah, and I'm not a fan of top-down models, and I think, what all of most of these pieces are saying is that we need to shift from top-down to bottom-up. And I personally think that corporations and companies should be owned by the workers, by like everyone who is in it, and maybe have shares based on how long you've been with the company and how much like, I don't know, student loans you have or you need to support a family or not. And that's, again, like, that's sort of what edgy, even though we do, we have issues with how much we pay people according to skills. Like, what if we lived in a world where all skills were equal? Like, someone managing makes as much as someone doing the cleaning because they're both working the same amount of hours. I don't know, and everyone has a stake in the organization that they keep running.
Wages for housework as well.
Yeah. Or maybe also think of economies that are outside of money.
Yes, I'm more concerned with the idea that we have to give people incentive to do things.
Yeah. It's like, come on.
Yeah.
It's not an academic to make money.
I think as an MBA of a hopefully high growth tech startup and a white guy, and a capitalist and a Warren supporter, I think it'll be revolution enough, quote unquote, to have Lourdes, to your point, greater worker ownership of the firms that they operate in, whether that's quotas for certain size companies like 10 or 20% or something like that. But just like the massive accumulation of wealth among such small people. Like, capitalism was evil and terrible 60 years ago, and that system was like wildly preferable to the one that exists today. Elizabeth Warren's made this point many times about, a lot of people talk about racial harmony coming once Black families make closer to the median net income in America. And her point is like, do you know how much closer those families' net income was to the median net income in the 1960s and 50s? It was higher. Wealth, wealth has gone like this. And the world has gotten way more stratified. And so we can't, and racial, depending on a lot of different things, racial progress has progressed in a number of areas. So like we have to unbuckle those a little bit, or just hoping that race gets figured out once everybody's middle class again. But just, the idea that LeBron James will have to work 1,200 years at his current salary, 1,200 years at LeBron James wages to amass enough wealth to be Jeff Bezos. And how many people have to work for 1,200 years to be LeBron James? Like, it's way out of whack.
They need to pay my student loans, and they need to, I don't know, they need to give us money, because nobody works as hard. Like, nobody works hard enough to make that much money.
Right. Right. Like 5,000 years of work.
Yeah, that's just not, it's not fair. And I hate that whenever someone gives me that like bootstraps thing, I'm like, really? Like, you think that someone who works 40 hours a week doing that should make that much more than 40 hours a week does? I'm angry now.
I forgot the phrase, but I think it's like Americans are just a lot of folks that support the billionaires are just, they believe that they'll be what?
Yeah.
They'll be like billionaires soon enough or whatever, and it's
Right.
like, that's not what 1% means. It doesn't mean like everybody gets there.
The estate tax doesn't impact anybody who's trying to give less than $11 million to their children. That's a lot. And everybody's worried, everybody's complains about this death tax and not being able to bequeath whatever little wealth we all have to our children. Anyway. So
I mean, but that's another thing, inheritance. I don't like, people have to cut out the large inheritances. I think it's okay to like pass down, a few thousand or whatever to help when you die. But like more than that, I just don't think it's fair. I mean, that's how like racism is constructed.
Even if no money is passed down, you have probably an easier education and social support and
right. Yeah, those
history.
things compound.
Yeah.
So we're coming up on 4.
For me, it's 6.
Or yeah, whatever it is over there. Wait, where are you?
In
Oh, you're in
Austin.
Texas.
I'm like, my nose. Oof.
Wait, Kevin, do you want to read that quote out? I feel like it'd be a great closer to our video.
It's just like things aren't better because the poor see themselves not as exploited proletariat, but as temporarily embarrassed millionaires. That's by John Steinbeck. Oh, and I'm rereading the Grapes of Wrath right now too.
Nice.
while I'm in isolation.
Yeah, you'll plenty of time to finish that.
reading for the first time. Yeah. Yeah. So that's the like Kelsey was saying, paying for that dream.
I got data together bingo, proletariat, workers, data justice.
Capitalism.
Yep. Proletariat hit right at the end there.
Okay, y'all. 4 o'clock.
All right.
We made it. Good seeing everybody. Nice
Bye.
chatting about this. It's good
Read my
to
readings,
feel
I like them.
Wash your hands. Stay away from your grandparents.
Take care, everybody. Bye.